Looking out at his modest farm, Thomas Miller knew the decision he was about to make would draw mockery and disbelief from everyone at the county livestock auction. Little did they know that buying this frail, aging cow would not only challenge their prejudices, but also reveal a truth about compassion that would leave even the hardest hearts in tears. The autumn morning wrapped Willow Creek Farm in a gentle embrace of mist and memories. Thomas Miller stood on his weathered porch, a steaming cup of coffee warming his calloused hands as he surveyed the land that had been his life's work for the past 20 years. The wooden steps beneath his feet creaked softly, worn smooth by countless mornings just like this one, when the world seemed to pause between night and day, holding its breath for what might come. His remaining 3 dairy cows grazed quietly in the distance, their black and white spots stark against the golden morning light. Clara, Rose, and Daisy, each named by his late wife Margaret, who had always insisted that every animal on their farm deserved the dignity of a proper name. The thought brought a sad smile to his face. The herd had been larger once, before. The drought 2 seasons ago forced him to sell half his cattle just to keep the farm afloat. Thomas set his coffee down on the porch railing and picked up the morning paper, its crisp pages carrying news he'd rather not read. "Modern farming revolution. Small farms face extinction," the headline declared in bold letters. Below it, a photograph showed the gleaming steel and concrete of Riverside Agricultural Corporation's new mega dairy facility, just 30 miles down the valley. These days, family farms like his were becoming as rare as summer snow, replaced by industrial operations that saw animals as units of production rather than living beings. The screen door squeaked behind him, and Thomas turned to see his daughter, Sarah, step out onto the porch. Her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her mother's old flannel shirt wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill. At 24, she was the spitting image of Margaret, right down to the worried crease between her eyebrows when something troubled her. "Dad," she said softly, joining him at the railing. "I've been thinking about the auction today. Are you absolutely sure about this? Everyone there will be looking for young, productive cattle. They'll laugh themselves silly if you bid on old Martha." Her voice carried the same protective tone Margaret had used whenever she thought Thomas was about to do something others might not understand. Thomas reached into his shirt pocket and carefully unfolded a photograph he'd carried for 15 years. The edges were worn soft, the colors fading, but the image still stirred something deep in his heart. "Some things matter more than what people think, Sarah," he replied, running his thumb gently over the photograph's surface. "Your mother understood that. Sometimes the right thing to do isn't always the thing that makes sense to others." Sarah leaned against his shoulder, studying the photograph she'd seen countless times, but never fully understood. "Does this have something to do with your promise to Mr. Henderson before he passed?" she asked, watching his expression carefully. Thomas nodded, carefully returning the photograph to his pocket. "James Henderson was more than just our neighbor, Sarah. That man saved this farm, saved our family during the big flood of '08. What I'm about to do today, well, it's about keeping a promise, yes, but it's also about remembering that the value of a life isn't measured in dollars and cents." The morning sun had risen higher now, burning away the mist and revealing the full extent of Willow Creek Farm. It wasn't much compared to the corporate operations buying up land all around them. Just 80 acres of rolling pasture, an old red barn that needed painting, and fences that seemed to require constant mending. But every inch of it had been shaped by love, hard work, and the kind of values that Thomas feared were becoming as rare as the small farms themselves. Walking to his truck, Thomas caught his reflection in the driver's side window. His patched overalls and scuffed work boots would stand out like a sore thumb among the pressed suits and polished leather at the county auction house. The corporate buyers would be there in force, their tablets and smartphones ready to calculate profit. Margins and production quotas. They wouldn't understand why anyone would bid on an aging cow well past her prime producing years. But as Thomas started the engine, he felt a quiet certainty settle over him. By day's end, the same people who would mock his decision would come to understand that sometimes the greatest wealth isn't counted in bank accounts or quarterly reports. Sometimes it's measured in the promises we keep and the debts of kindness we repay, even when the whole world thinks we're fools for doing so. Sarah watched from the porch as her father's old blue pickup disappeared down the gravel driveway, kicking up a trail of dust in the morning light. She clutched her mother's old flannel shirt tighter around her shoulders, remembering how Margaret used to say that the truest measure of a person isn't in what they do when everyone is watching, but in the promises they keep when they think no one will notice. The 15-mile drive to Cedar Valley Auction House gave Thomas plenty of time to wrestle with his thoughts. His old pickup rumbled along the country roads, each familiar landmark stirring memories he'd tucked away like pressed flowers in the pages of time. He passed the Henderson place, now owned by Riverside Agricultural Corporation, its once cozy farmhouse dwarfed by modern steel structures that gleamed coldly in the morning sun. James Henderson's voice echoed in his mind, clear as the day he'd spoken the words that would shape today's events. "Promise me something, Tom," he'd said, his weathered hand gripping Thomas's arm with surprising strength for a man in his final days. "When the time comes, and you'll know when it is, take care of old Martha for me. She's more than just a cow to our family." Thomas had made that promise without hesitation, though he hadn't fully understood its meaning at the time. Now, 15 years later, the pieces were finally falling into place. He'd heard through the farming grapevine that Riverside was liquidating the last of Henderson's original herd, including Martha, who'd somehow survived all these years. The corporate suits saw her as nothing more than a liability now, a drain on resources that needed to be cleared from their books. The memory of that terrible spring flood in '08 surfaced as Thomas approached the auction house. He'd been struggling to keep the farm afloat after Margaret's illness drained their savings. Sarah was just 9 then, too young to understand why her father's eyes carried such worry. That's when James Henderson appeared at their door one stormy night, leading 2 of his best milk cows. "These girls need a good home, Tom," he'd said, refusing any payment. "Margaret would never forgive me if I let her family go under." Those cows had saved Willow Creek Farm, their milk production helping Thomas weather the worst financial storm of his life. But it wasn't just the cows. It was Henderson's quiet dignity, his understanding that sometimes pride needs to bow to kindness. The parking lot of Cedar Valley Auction House was already filling up when Thomas arrived. Sleek SUVs and luxury pickup trucks lined the spaces, their pristine paint jobs making his old blue Ford look even more out of place. He recognized several vehicles belonging to Riverside's executives, their company logos emblazoned on the doors. Like badges of authority, inside the auction house, the atmosphere crackled with activity. The main hall had been transformed into a showcase of modern farming efficiency, with digital displays showing production statistics and genetic lineage charts. Corporate buyers in pressed shirts and polished boots clustered around tablets discussing profit margins and optimization strategies. Thomas made his way to the holding area, where the day's livestock waited in temporary pens. He found Martha in the last stall, her once proud frame showing the wear of years. Her coat, though dull now, still carried traces of the rich brown color he remembered. What others saw as an elderly, unproductive animal, Thomas saw as a living, linked to a promise made and a debt unpaid. "Well, if it isn't Thomas Miller," a voice called out, dripping with mock friendliness. Richard Conway, Riverside's regional director, approached with the confident stride of someone used to always getting his way. "Don't tell me you're actually here to bid. Times must be better than they look at that little operation of yours." Thomas nodded politely, though his jaw tightened. "Just here to keep a promise, Richard." Conway's laugh drew attention from nearby. "Buyers." "Promises. This is business, Miller. We deal in numbers, not sentiment. But hey, feel free to watch how real farming works these days." He gestured to his tablet, displaying Martha's statistics. "This old girl's headed for processing. Anyway, not worth the feed she consumes. Not worth—" The words stung, but Thomas held his ground. He thought of the photograph in his pocket, of James Henderson's final days, and of a story that only he knew, a story that would soon change everything. Conway's smugness, the dismissive glances from other buyers, even the electronic displays, reducing lives to data points. None of it could shake his resolve. Sarah's voice echoed in his memory. "Dad, what if they don't understand?" He'd told her understanding wasn't always necessary for doing what's right. Now, standing in the auction house, surrounded by the very people who thought small farmers like him were relics of the past, Thomas felt the weight of his promise more than ever. He watched as Martha slowly raised her head, her dark eyes meeting his with a quiet dignity that transcended her aged appearance. In that moment, Thomas saw not just a cow past her prime, but a testament to a way of life that valued relationships over profits, promises over practicality. The auction would begin soon, and with it would come the mockery he knew was inevitable. But Thomas Miller had weathered stronger storms than ridicule, and by day's end, those who came to laugh would leave with a different understanding of value, loyalty, and the debts we owe to those who help us in our darkest hours. The Cedar Valley. Auction house filled quickly as the morning progressed, the wooden benches creaking under the weight of countless buyers and spectators. Thomas found a spot near the back, away from the clusters of corporate representatives who dominated the front rows. The air was thick with the smell of leather, coffee, and expectations, punctuated by the constant chatter of business deals and market predictions. Eleanor Henderson, James's widow, sat 3 rows ahead, her silver hair neatly pinned back. She hadn't noticed Thomas yet, and he preferred it that way, at least for now. Her presence here wasn't a coincidence. She always attended these auctions, quietly witnessing the dismantling of her family's legacy piece by piece. Each sale seemed to carve another chunk from her heart, though she bore it with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her late husband. The auctioneer, a barrel-chested man named Frank Morris, stepped up to his podium, tapping the microphone to call for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Cedar Valley's spring livestock auction. We've got a full day ahead, with some prime specimens from Riverside Agricultural's latest acquisition." Richard Conway stood near the front, surrounded by his team of analysts, their tablets glowing with spreadsheets and projections. He caught Thomas's eye and smirked, leaning over to whisper something to his colleagues that made them chuckle and glance back. Thomas kept his expression neutral, though his hands tightened on the worn brim of his cap. The first hour passed in a blur of rapid-fire bids and falling gavels. Young heifers and prime milk cows went for impressive sums, each sale accompanied by polite applause and the rustle of papers. Thomas watched Eleanor's shoulders tense with each animal from her former herd that went to corporate buyers. Then Martha was led into the arena. The old cow moved slowly, her steps careful but dignified. Years of hard work had left their mark on her frame, but there was still a gentle intelligence in her eyes that Thomas remembered from years ago. The sudden hush that fell over the crowd was almost painful. Not the respectful silence of anticipation, but the awkward pause of collective judgment. "Next up, lot number 47, Frank announced, his usual enthusiasm notably diminished. "Martha, Holstein Jersey Cross, 15 years old. Used for—" He squinted at his papers, clearly uncomfortable. "Well, she's been part of the Henderson herd since birth. We'll start the bidding at, shall we say, $200. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Conway's voice cut through the murmurs. "Come on, Frank. You'll be lucky to get hamburger price for that one. She's barely worth the fuel to transport her to processing. More laughter followed, harder this time. Eleanor's back stiffened, her hands clasping tightly in her lap. Thomas saw her blink rapidly, fighting back tears. "All right then," Frank conceded. "Let's start at $100. Do I hear $100 for lot 47? The silence that followed was deafening. Conway made a show of checking his phone, while his colleagues exchanged amused glances. The corporate buyers, who had been so eager moments ago, now seemed fascinated by their shoes or tablets. "I bid $100, Thomas called out, his voice steady and clear. The reaction was immediate. Heads turned, whispers erupted, and Conway's face split into a predatory grin. "Well, well," he announced loudly. "Looks like Tom Miller's feeling charitable today. Tell us, Tom, planning to start a petting zoo?" More laughter, but Thomas kept his eyes on Martha, who had turned her head at the sound of his voice. There was recognition there, he was sure of it. $150, Thomas continued, ignoring the jeers. Conway's entertainment evolved into irritation. "Now look here, Miller," he called out, standing to face Thomas directly. "Let's not waste everyone's time. That cow's got one trip left to make, and it's to the processing plant. $200. A gasp went through the crowd. Conway had just bid against his own assessment of Martha's worth, purely out of spite. Eleanor half turned in her seat, her eyes meeting Thomas's with a mix of confusion and hope. $250, Thomas responded calmly. "This is ridiculous," Conway snapped. $300. And Miller, this is me doing you a favor by saving you from yourself. The auction house had gone completely silent now, the entertainment of the moment transforming into something else, something electric with tension. Even Frank seemed unsure how to proceed, his gavel hovering uncertainly. $350, Thomas said, standing up slowly. His voice carried a weight that silenced the last few whispers. Conway's face reddened. "You're making a fool of yourself, Miller. $400, and I'll personally make sure this animal goes straight to processing, just to prove a point." Eleanor stood abruptly, her chair scraping back. "Mr. Conway," she began, her voice shaking with emotion, but Thomas's gentle, "It's all right, Eleanor," made her pause. Thomas reached into his pocket and withdrew the worn photograph, holding it carefully, as he'd done countless times before. "You know, Richard," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room, 15 years ago, Martha here did something remarkable, something that's worth every penny I'm about to spend, and then some." The auction house remained silent as Thomas slowly made his way down the aisle, the worn photograph held carefully in his weathered hands. Every step echoed against the wooden floorboards, marking the gravity of the moment. Eleanor Henderson's eyes followed him, a mix of curiosity and recognition beginning to dawn on her face. "You see, Richard," Thomas began, his voice steady and clear, "this photograph was taken on the night of the great flood of '08, the night that changed everything for my family." He held up the faded image so Conway could see it. "The night Martha here saved my daughter's life." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Conway's smirk faltered slightly, but he maintained his dismissive stance. "What are you talking about, Miller?" Thomas turned to face the crowd, but his eyes settled gently on Eleanor. That spring was the worst we'd seen in 50 years. The creek that runs between the Henderson farm and mine turned into a raging river in a matter of hours. My Sarah, she was just 9 then, had gone to check on our cattle before the storm hit. When the banks burst, his voice caught for a moment. When the banks burst, she was trapped on the wrong side. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, memory flooding her features. "James never told me," she whispered. "No, he wouldn't have." Thomas nodded, a sad smile crossing his face. "That was his way. But Martha here, she was living on your north pasture then, Eleanor. She was already a good mother, had raised 7 calves of her own by that point, and somehow she knew exactly what to do when she heard Sarah's screams." Thomas unfolded the photograph carefully, revealing its contents to the now captivated audience. This picture was taken by James just after it happened. See that dark shape in the floodwaters? That's Martha, swimming against the current. And that smaller shape clinging to her back? That's my Sarah. The silence in the auction house had transformed from awkward to reverent. Even Conway seemed unable to maintain his air of superiority as Thomas continued. Martha broke through the fence when she heard Sarah crying for help. She swam out to where my daughter was clinging to a tree branch, already half submerged in the rising waters. And then, this is the part I still can hardly believe, she positioned herself so Sarah could grab onto her neck. She fought that current for almost half a mile, keeping her head above water until she could find a safe place to get Sarah to shore. Thomas walked over to Martha, who had been standing quietly throughout his story. He placed a gentle hand on her weathered neck. James took this picture right after they made it to safety. He was there with his tractor, helping with the evacuation. He caught the moment Sarah was still holding on to Martha's neck, both of them exhausted but alive. Eleanor had made her way down to the auction floor, tears streaming freely down her face now. "I remember that night," she said softly. "James came home soaking wet, but he never said. He just said he'd been helping with the flood response." "That was James," Thomas smiled. "Always doing the right thing, never wanting recognition. But he made me promise that night. He made me swear that when the time came, I'd make sure Martha was taken care of. He said, 'A cow like that, with a heart that big, she deserves to live out her days in peace.'" The atmosphere in the auction house had completely transformed. Where there had been mockery, there was now a heavy silence filled with reflection. Several of the farmers in attendance removed their hats in respect. Even some of Conway's analysts were discreetly wiping their eyes. "So you see, Richard," Thomas continued, turning back to Conway, "when you talk about production numbers and processing plants, you're missing something essential. Something that James Henderson understood better than most. The true value of a life isn't measured in dollars or productivity. It's measured in the lives it touches, the differences it makes." $500, Thomas announced clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. $500 for the cow that saved my daughter's life, for the animal that showed more humanity that night than some folks show in a lifetime, for the chance to keep a promise to a good man who never asked for recognition or reward. Conway stood frozen, his tablet forgotten in his hands. The spreadsheets and profit margins glowing on its screen seemed suddenly meaningless in the face of such a story. The other corporate buyers, who had been so quick to laugh earlier, now looked anywhere but at Thomas and Martha. Eleanor stepped forward, placing her hand next to Thomas's on Martha's neck. "James would be proud," she said softly. "He always said, 'You were a man who understood the true meaning of value.'" Frank, the auctioneer, cleared his throat, his voice thick with emotion. $500 bid for lot 47. Do I hear any other bids? The silence that followed was profound. Not even Conway dared to speak. Going once, going twice. The fall of the gavel echoed through the auction house like a thunderclap, but it wasn't the sound of a sale being completed. It was the sound of a promise being kept, of a debt being honored, and of a reminder to everyone present that some things in life transcend the cold calculations of profit and loss. The afternoon sun painted long shadows across Cedar Valley Auction House's parking lot as Thomas prepared to lead Martha to his trailer. The auction had continued after his revelation, but something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere. The rapid-fire bidding and corporate efficiency had given way to a more thoughtful, subdued tone, as if everyone present was reconsidering what truly mattered in their calculations of worth. Eleanor Henderson walked beside Thomas, her hand resting gently on Martha's back as they moved slowly across the gravel. "You know," she said softly, James used to sit on our porch in the evenings, watching Martha with her calves. He'd say there was something special about her, something you couldn't put in a ledger or measure in a spreadsheet. I never knew just how right he was. A small crowd had gathered near Thomas's old blue pickup, but it wasn't the mocking audience from earlier. Farmers, both young and old, approached one by one to pat Martha's neck or share a quiet word with Thomas. Even some of the corporate analysts hung back respectfully, their tablets dark in their hands, as if the devices themselves knew their limitations in measuring certain kinds of value. Richard Conway stood apart from the group, his earlier bravado replaced by something that looked remarkably like shame. After several moments of internal struggle, he approached Thomas, his polished boots scuffing uncertainly in the gravel. "Miller," he began, then stopped, searching for words. "Thomas, I owe you an apology. More than one, actually." He glanced at Martha, then back at Thomas. "We get so caught up in numbers and efficiency that sometimes we forget," he trailed off, color rising in his cheeks, "that we forget these animals are more than just units on a spreadsheet." Thomas finished gently, "That maybe there's something to be said for the old ways, for knowing each animal, for understanding that value isn't always something you can calculate." Conway nodded, looking genuinely thoughtful for the first time since Thomas had known him. "My grandfather had a farm," he said quietly. "Nothing big, just a small operation like yours. He knew every cow by name, treated them like family. I used to think he was foolish, that he could have made so much more money if he'd modernized, expanded. But today made me remember something he used to say: the richest man isn't the one with the most in his bank account, but the one who knows the true worth of what he has." As if understanding she was being discussed, Martha turned her gentle eyes and toward Conway. The corporate executive reached out hesitantly and patted her neck, a gesture that would have been unthinkable hours earlier. Sarah's pickup truck appeared at the entrance to the parking lot, kicking up dust as she hurried to join her father. She'd been waiting for his call, and the news of Martha's story had brought her racing to the auction house. As she approached the group, her eyes were bright with tears. "Dad!" she called out, rushing forward to embrace him. Then she turned to Martha, wrapping her arms around the old cow's neck in a gesture that brought many in the crowd back to the photograph, to the image of a young girl clinging to this same neck in raging floodwaters. "I remember your warmth," Sarah whispered to Martha. "I was so cold and scared, but you were so warm and strong. I never forgot that feeling, even though I was too young to understand everything that happened that day." Eleanor touched Sarah's shoulder gently. "Would you and your father join me for dinner? I have something at the house, some photos James kept from that night, and letters he wrote about both of you. I think it's time they were shared." As Thomas helped Martha into his trailer, more people approached, but not to leave. Instead, they began sharing their own stories, tales of animals who had shown extraordinary loyalty, of moments when the connection between human and creature transcended any economic consideration. Old-timers spoke of farming traditions passed down through generations, while younger farmers admitted their growing discomfort with treating livestock as mere commodities. One of Conway's young analysts, Emily Chen, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Miller, would you be willing to speak at our next regional agricultural conference? I think there's a conversation we need to have about balancing efficiency with ethics, about finding a way to preserve what matters while moving forward." Thomas looked at Conway, who nodded encouragingly. "Sometimes," Conway added, "we need to be reminded of what we risk losing in the name of progress." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the gathering, Thomas felt the weight of the day's events settle into something profound and meaningful. Martha stood quietly in the trailer, her presence a testament to the power of promises kept and values preserved. The photograph in his pocket, now joined by others Eleanor would share, wasn't just a record of a dramatic rescue. It was proof that some things in life couldn't be measured in conventional terms. "You know," Thomas addressed the group, his voice carrying the wisdom of experience, "farming isn't just about producing food or making profit. It's about being stewards of something greater than ourselves. It's about understanding that every life has value, that every creature deserves dignity, and that sometimes the greatest wealth we can possess is the knowledge that we've honored our promises and stayed true to our principles." As Thomas and Sarah prepared to leave with plans to join Eleanor for dinner, the parking lot of Cedar Valley Auction House had become more than just a place of business. It had become a place of transformation, where a simple story about an old cow had reminded everyone present about the things that truly matter: loyalty, compassion, and the kind of wealth that can't be counted in dollars and cents. 1 year had passed since the auction that changed everything. The autumn morning at Willow Creek Farm carried an echo of that fateful day, but everything else had transformed in ways Thomas Miller could never have predicted. Martha now spent her days in a special pasture near the farmhouse, where the grass was sweetest and the shade of old oak trees provided perfect respite from the summer heat. She had become something of a local celebrity, with families often stopping by to hear her story and pay their respects. Thomas had installed a comfortable bench near her favorite spot, and it wasn't unusual to find Eleanor Henderson sitting there in the afternoons, sharing quiet moments with the cow who had meant so much to her late husband. Sarah had taken to documenting Martha's story, collecting photographs and testimonials from that night in '08. What started as a personal project had grown into something larger, a book about the souls of animals and the farmers who understood them. Her research had uncovered dozens of similar stories from across the country, tales of extraordinary acts by ordinary farm animals that challenged the notion that livestock were mere commodities. The most surprising change had come from Richard Conway. The regional agricultural conference where Thomas spoke had marked a turning point for Riverside Agricultural Corporation. Conway, deeply moved by Martha's story and his own rediscovered connection to his grandfather's farming wisdom, had initiated a comprehensive review of their practices. "Efficiency doesn't have to mean losing our humanity," Conway had announced at the conference, standing beside Thomas and Martha, who had been specially transported for the event. "We can embrace progress while honoring the traditions and values that make farming more than just a business." Under Conway's new direction, Riverside had begun a pilot program they called the Henderson Initiative, named in honor of James Henderson's philosophy. The program focused on balancing modern farming techniques with animal welfare and traditional farming wisdom. They had started setting aside portions of their industrial operations for more traditional hands-on farming methods, and their marketing now proudly told stories of individual animals and the farmers who cared for them. The day's biggest gathering was about to begin. Thomas stood on his porch, watching cars pull up the gravel driveway. Today marked the first anniversary of Martha's homecoming, and it had somehow evolved into an annual celebration of farming heritage. Families from across the county were arriving, bringing dishes to share and stories to tell. Eleanor arrived early, carrying a leather-bound album she'd discovered in James's study. "Found more photographs," she said, settling into her favorite rocking chair on the porch. James kept a journal, too. He wrote about Martha the day she was born, said there was something in her eyes, a kindness he couldn't explain. Sarah emerged from the house carrying a tray of lemonade, her new engagement ring catching the sunlight. Her fiancé, Mike, one of Conway's former analysts who'd quit his corporate job to learn traditional farming, followed with a stack of cups. They had met at the agricultural conference, bonding over their shared vision of farming's future. "Dad," Sarah called out, "the school bus is coming up the road." Thomas smiled, watching the yellow bus wind its way toward the farm. The local elementary school had started bringing students for monthly visits, teaching them about farming heritage and the special connection between humans and animals. Martha had proven to be a natural teacher, her gentle patience with children reinforcing every story told about her character. Conway's car pulled up next, now a familiar sight at the farm. He stepped out wearing jeans and work boots, his corporate suits long since retired for a more hands-on approach to agricultural management. The transformation in him had been perhaps the most profound of all. He had become a bridge between two worlds, helping large operations understand the value of traditional farming wisdom while helping small farmers access modern resources and support. "Thomas," he called out, waving a document. "Wait until you hear this. The State Agricultural Board approved our proposal. The Henderson Initiative is going statewide. They want to use Martha's story as the cornerstone of their new educational program about ethical farming practices." The children from the bus were gathering near Martha's pasture, their excited chatter carrying on the autumn breeze. Thomas watched as the old cow made her way toward them, moving slower now, but with the same dignity she'd always possessed. A young girl reached out to pat her neck, and for a moment Thomas was transported back to that flood-ravaged night, seeing Sarah clinging to that same neck as Martha fought the current. Emily Chen, the analyst who had first suggested Thomas speak at the conference, now headed the Henderson Initiative's research department. She had arrived with Conway and was setting up a display of their latest findings. "The data is remarkable," she explained to the gathering crowd. "Farms that have adopted the balanced approach are showing improved animal welfare metrics while maintaining profitability. It turns out treating animals with dignity isn't just ethical, it's good business. As the afternoon progressed, Thomas found himself surrounded by a community transformed. Farmers who had once competed now collaborated, sharing stories and wisdom. Corporate executives sat with old-timers, learning about traditional methods, while offering insights about sustainable scaling. Children ran between the adults, their laughter mixing with the gentle lowing of cattle and the rustle of autumn leaves. Martha presided over it all from her shaded spot, accepting gentle pats and treats with her characteristic grace. She had become more than just a cow who had saved a little girl's life. She had become a symbol of everything that was worth preserving in farming culture, a reminder that the greatest achievements often came wrapped in the humblest packages. As the sun began to set, Thomas gathered everyone for the tradition that had spontaneously begun at these gatherings. They formed a circle near Martha's pasture, and one by one, people shared stories of moments when they had learned to look beyond surface value to find true worth, in animals, in people, in themselves. "The real miracle," Thomas concluded, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering, "wasn't just that Martha saved Sarah that night. The real miracle is how her story continues to save something precious in all of us, our ability to see with our hearts, to measure worth in love and loyalty rather than numbers, and to remember that the greatest legacy we can leave is the kindness we show to every living thing under our care." As if in agreement, Martha let out a soft moo, bringing smiles and a few tears to the gathered faces. The legacy of one old cow had become a movement, a reminder, and a promise kept, not just to James Henderson, but to the future of farming itself. The success of the Henderson Initiative had sparked something unexpected in the farming community. As winter melted into spring, Thomas found himself at the center of a movement that was spreading far beyond Cedar Valley. Farmers from neighboring states had begun making pilgrimages to Willow Creek Farm, eager to learn about the philosophy that had transformed their region's approach to agriculture. One crisp morning, as Thomas was doing his regular checks on Martha, a sleek black car pulled up his driveway. The woman who stepped out wasn't dressed for farm work. Her suit spoke of corporate boardrooms rather than barn floors. But there was something in her expression that reminded Thomas of James Henderson's thoughtful gaze. "Mr. Miller?" she called out, making her way carefully across the muddy yard. "I'm Dr. Catherine Wells, from the National Agricultural Research Institute. I've been following your story. Everyone has, really. But I'm here because we've noticed something remarkable in your region's data." Thomas leaned against the fence post, Martha's warm presence solid behind him. "What kind of data?" Catherine pulled out a tablet, not unlike the ones Conway's team used to carry, but instead of profit margins, it showed graphs of animal welfare metrics, productivity rates, and something labeled sustainable engagement patterns. Since the Henderson Initiative began, she explained, her eyes bright with excitement, we've seen a dramatic shift in both productivity and animal welfare metrics. But here's the fascinating part. It's not just the farms directly involved in the program. The entire region is showing improvements. It's like Martha's story didn't just change hearts, it changed the entire agricultural ecosystem. Thomas watched as Martha gently nudged his shoulder, her way of asking for attention. He reached back to scratch her favorite spot, remembering all the changes the past year had brought. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "one story can help people remember what they already knew in their hearts." Catherine nodded eagerly. "Exactly, and that's why I'm here. The Institute wants to establish a research center focused on integrating traditional farming wisdom with modern agricultural practices. We'd like to base it here, Mr. Miller, right here at Willow Creek Farm." The proposal took Thomas by surprise. "Here? But this is just a small family farm." "That's precisely why it needs to be here," Catherine insisted. "You and Martha have shown us that the biggest changes often start in the smallest places. We're not talking about turning your farm into a corporate facility. Quite the opposite. We want to create a learning center where farmers from all over the country can come to see how traditional values and modern methods can work together." Sarah, who had been listening from the barn doorway, stepped forward. "Like what Dad and Mr. Conway have been doing, but on a national scale." "Exactly," Catherine smiled. "The Henderson Initiative has proven that there's a middle path between industrial efficiency and traditional farming values. We want to help other regions find that balance." As if understanding the weight of the moment, Martha moved closer to the fence, drawing Catherine's attention. The researcher's professional demeanor softened as she reached out to touch the old cow's neck. "She really is remarkable, isn't she? She taught us all something important," Thomas said quietly. "About value, about dignity, about keeping promises. Maybe she has more to teach." The next few hours were spent walking the property with Catherine, discussing possibilities. The Institute's vision was both ambitious and respectful. They wanted to preserve the working farm while adding educational facilities where farmers could learn about both traditional and modern methods. Martha's pasture would become a central feature, a living reminder of the values at the heart of their mission. Eleanor joined them for lunch, bringing her collection of James's journals. "You know," she said, spreading them out on the kitchen and table, "James always said farming was about more than just growing food. It was about growing wisdom. He'd be proud to see his ideas helping shape the future." Catherine was fascinated by the journals, especially James's detailed observations about animal behavior and farm management. "This is exactly what we're talking about," she exclaimed. "This kind of generational knowledge, combined with modern research methods, it could revolutionize how we think about sustainable agriculture." As the day progressed, more visitors arrived. Conway came by with his latest reports on the Henderson Initiative's success. Emily Chen brought proposals for expanding their research programs. Even some of the local farmers stopped in, curious about the activity at Willow Creek Farm. The kitchen table became an impromptu conference room, with James's journals sitting alongside Catherine's tablets and Conway's reports. Martha watched it all through the kitchen window, her gentle presence a reminder of how this all began. "You know what this means, Dad?" Sarah said quietly as they watched the group discuss plans. "Martha didn't just save me that night in the flood. She's still saving things, saving ways of farming that might have been lost, saving connections between people and animals, saving wisdom that deserves to be preserved." Thomas nodded, thinking about how one decision, keeping a promise to an old friend, had set all this in motion. "Your mother used to say that every choice we make plants a seed," he replied. "Some seeds take longer to grow than others, but if they're planted with love and tended with care, they can grow into something bigger than we ever imagined." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the farm, Thomas stood with Catherine at Martha's pasture one last time. The old cow had settled into her favorite spot under the oak tree, contentedly watching the activity around her farm. "We'll do this right," Catherine promised, understanding the responsibility they were undertaking. "This place will stay true to its roots while helping others find their way forward. Martha's legacy will help shape the future of farming, Mr. Miller." "Not bad for an old cow everyone thought was worthless," Thomas smiled, watching Martha in the golden evening light. "She's proved again and again that true worth isn't in what something seems to be, but in what it has the heart to become." The transformation of Willow Creek Farm into the National Center for Agricultural Heritage began on a warm spring morning, 6 months after Dr. Catherine Wells's first visit. Thomas stood at his familiar spot on the porch, coffee cup in hand, watching as the first construction vehicles carefully made their way up his driveway. But these weren't the harbingers of industrial change he'd once feared. Instead, they carried materials for something remarkable. "The designs are beautiful, Dad," Sarah said, spreading the blueprints across the porch railing. The architectural plans showed a harmonious blend of old and new. Traditional barn structures updated with sustainable technology, learning spaces that looked like they'd grown naturally from the landscape, and at the heart of it all, Martha's pasture, preserved and enhanced as a living classroom. Catherine had kept her word about doing things right. The Institute's team had spent months consulting with local farmers, studying James Henderson's journals and working with environmental experts to ensure every addition to the farm served both progress and preservation. "Look here," Sarah pointed to a section of the plans. "They're calling it Wisdom's Garden, the whole area around Martha's pasture. It's going to be a place where people can learn about the emotional intelligence of farm animals, with Martha's story as the cornerstone." The construction team was led by Mike Carter, a local builder who'd grown up on a farm himself. He understood the importance of preserving the soul of the place while preparing it for its new role. As he approached the porch, his respect for the land was evident in every careful step. "Mr. Miller," he called out, "we're ready to begin, but we'd like to start with a tradition my grandfather taught me. Would you and Martha join us for a moment?" Thomas and Sarah followed Mike to where his crew had gathered near Martha's pasture. The old cow, curious about the visitors, made her way to the fence. Mike pulled out a small cloth bag and began to explain. "On my grandfather's farm, whenever we started a new building, we'd plant something first. A reminder that everything we build should honor what grows naturally." He opened the bag, revealing a handful of heritage wheat seeds. "These are from the same strain my grandfather used to plant. I thought maybe we could start by planting these around Martha's pasture." The simple gesture brought tears to Sarah's eyes. One by one, the construction workers stepped forward to plant seeds along the fence line, each adding their own story about farming traditions they'd grown up with. Martha watched the proceedings with her characteristic gentle interest, occasionally reaching out to nuzzle someone's shoulder in encouragement. Eleanor arrived mid-morning, carrying a sapling in a pot. It's from James's favorite oak tree, she explained. I've been nurturing this little one for years, waiting for the right moment. I think this is it. As they planted the sapling in a spot where it would one day provide shade for future generations, Conway's car pulled up. He wasn't alone. With him was a film crew from the National Agricultural Education Network. "Hope you don't mind," he said, approaching Thomas. "But we think this deserves to be documented, not just the construction, but the whole process of bridging past and future." Martha's story was just the beginning. What's happening here could change farming education across the country. The film crew's young director, Maria Santos, had a vision that went beyond mere documentation. "We want to capture the spirit of what's happening here," she explained. "The way traditional wisdom and modern knowledge are coming together. It's not just about building a research center, it's about preserving a way of seeing the world." Throughout the day, more visitors arrived. Local farmers brought seeds from their own heritage crops to add to Mike's wheat planting. Catherine's research team set up temporary monitors to begin documenting the farm's ecosystem. Even some of Conway's former corporate colleagues came by, their perspectives transformed by the past year's events. Dr. Chen had established a preliminary classroom under a tent near Martha's pasture, where she was already conducting workshops on integrating traditional farming wisdom with modern research methods. "Look at this," she called out excitedly, showing Thomas some preliminary data. "We're finding that farms that maintain strong emotional connections with their animals show consistently better outcomes, not just in welfare metrics, but in productivity too." As the day progressed, Thomas found himself moving between past and future, watching his farm begin its evolution while holding tight to its core values. Martha's presence remained central, her calm demeanor seeming to approve each new development as it unfolded. Late in the afternoon, a school bus arrived, carrying students from the local elementary school. They were part of a new program Sarah had helped develop, connecting children with farming heritage. The kids gathered around Martha's fence, their excited chatter mixing with the sounds of construction and planning. Mr. Miller, one small girl, called out, "My grandpa says you're building a place where farmers can learn to be kind. Is that true?" Thomas knelt down beside her. "We're building a place where people can remember what farmers have always known, that the best way to grow anything, whether it's crops or knowledge, is to start with kindness and respect." As the sun began to set, the construction team packed up for the day, but not before Mike insisted on one final tradition. Everyone gathered in a circle around the newly planted oak sapling, joining hands in a moment of silence for the work ahead. Thomas looked around the circle. Construction workers, researchers, farmers, corporate executives, children, all united. In this moment of transition, Martha stood at her fence, silhouetted against the setting sun, still watching over everything as she had done that fateful night in the flood. "You know," Catherine said softly, "when I first proposed this project to the Institute, they asked why it had to be here, at a small family farm. Now they understand. Some places have a spirit that can't be manufactured or replicated. It has to grow naturally, nurtured by stories, wisdom, and heart." The heritage wheat seeds were already in the ground. The oak sapling stood ready to grow, and Martha's pasture remained a steady constant in the midst of change. Willow Creek Farm was embarking on a new chapter, but its heart, the understanding that true value lies in the connections we nurture and the wisdom we preserve, remained unchangedly strong. The first frost of autumn painted Willow Creek Farm in crystalline white, 3 months after construction began on the National Center for Agricultural Heritage. The new buildings were taking shape, their wooden frames rising from the earth like fresh saplings, but it was what was happening inside them that truly marked the transformation. Thomas stood in the doorway of the newly completed Heritage Hall, watching as Sarah led the first official tour group through the space. The walls were lined with photographs telling Martha's story, alongside passages from James Henderson's journals and images of traditional farming practices from across the country. "This is where it all began," Sarah was saying to the group of agricultural students gathered around her, "with one farmer keeping a promise, one cow proving her worth, and one community remembering what really matters in farming." The students weren't what Thomas had expected when they'd planned these educational programs. Instead of just agriculture majors, there were future veterinarians, environmental scientists, business students, and even a few studying psychology. Martha's story had sparked interest far beyond traditional farming circles. Dr. Catherine Wells appeared at Thomas's side, her tablet forgotten in her hands as she watched the tour. "We've received applications from every state," she said quietly. "Everyone wants to be part of what's happening here. But what's most interesting is how many corporate farms are sending their managers to learn." Indeed, Thomas had noticed a shift in the type of visitors coming to Willow Creek. Conway's transformation had started a ripple effect through the industrial farming community. More and more corporate agricultural managers were coming to learn about what they called the Martha method, an approach to farming that balanced efficiency with empathy. Martha herself had become something of a professor emeritus at the center. Though slowing down with age, she still had an uncanny ability to connect with visitors. She seemed to know exactly when to approach the fence, when to offer a gentle nuzzle, when to simply stand as a quiet reminder of the power of compassion. That morning's group included a young corporate manager named David Chen, who had initially approached with skepticism written across his face. But as Sarah led them to Martha's pasture, Thomas watched a familiar transformation take place. "I don't understand," David said, reaching out tentatively to touch Martha's neck. "All my training has been about numbers, efficiency, scale. But standing here, it feels like I've been missing something important." Eleanor, who had taken to spending most of her days at the center, sharing stories and wisdom from James's journals, smiled knowingly. "James used to say that farming isn't just about growing crops or raising livestock. It's about growing wisdom and raising consciousness." The heritage wheat that Mike's crew had planted along Martha's fence was now tall and golden, swaying in the autumn breeze. The oak sapling from James's tree had taken root and showed promise of strong growth. But it was the less tangible changes that really marked the farm's transformation. Dr. Chen's research team had set up a permanent observation station near Martha's pasture, documenting what they called interspecies emotional intelligence. Their findings were revolutionary, proving scientifically what farmers like James Henderson had known intuitively about the deep connections between humans and animals. "Look at this," Dr. Chen explained to the group, pointing to her monitors. "When visitors interact with Martha, we see measurable changes in both human and animal stress indicators. It's as if she's teaching empathy at a physiological level." The film crew that had documented the center's construction had stayed on, captured by the ongoing story. Maria Santos, the director, had expanded her project into a series about the changing face of American agriculture, with Willow Creek Farm at its heart. "It's not just about Martha anymore," Maria explained as she set up for another interview. "It's about how one story can change the way we think about value, about progress, about what it means to be stewards of the land and its creatures." Conway, who now served on the center's advisory board, arrived for the afternoon session. He had transformed from a corporate executive into something of a farming philosopher, helping other business leaders understand the false dichotomy between profit and compassion. "I used to think efficiency and empathy were opposites," he told the gathered students. "But Martha and Thomas taught me that true efficiency comes from understanding and respecting the natural connections that make farming work. When we honor those connections, everything else falls into place." As the day progressed, Thomas noticed David Chen sitting alone on the bench near Martha's pasture, deep in thought. He approached quietly, recognizing the look of someone whose worldview was shifting. "Troubled?" Thomas asked, settling beside him. "I've spent 5 years implementing efficiency protocols," David replied, watching Martha graze peacefully. "I can tell you the optimal square footage per animal, the perfect feed ratios, the exact time it takes to maximize production. But being here, watching her, I'm realizing there are things we can't measure that might matter more than all our calculations." Thomas nodded, understanding the journey this young man was beginning. "You know, when I made that promise to James Henderson, I thought I was just agreeing to take care of one old cow. I never imagined it would lead to all this. But that's the thing about wisdom. It grows best when we plant it in good soil and let it spread naturally." The afternoon. Sun cast long shadows across Wisdom's garden, where Martha continued her gentle work of teaching by example. The heritage wheat rustled in the breeze, the young oak reached toward the sky, and all around, the seeds of change that had been planted with such care were beginning to bear fruit. As Sarah wrapped up her tour, she brought the group back to the Heritage Hall's central display, the photograph of Martha saving her from the flood. "This center isn't just about preserving the past," she told them. "It's about understanding that the most valuable lessons often come from the most unexpected teachers. Every animal has a story, every farmer holds wisdom, and every choice we make plants seeds for the future." The first major snowfall of winter blanketed Willow Creek Farm in pristine white, transforming the National Center for Agricultural Heritage into a scene from a pastoral painting. Thomas had made sure Martha's barn was especially warm and comfortable, with fresh straw and extra blankets to ease her aging joints. At 17, she was moving slower now, but her eyes remained as bright and wise as ever. The morning's first visitors weren't the usual students or researchers, but a group that made Thomas's heart particularly full. A dozen children from the local hospital's pediatric ward had come to meet Martha, bundled up against the cold in colorful winter gear. The hospital's therapy program had heard about Martha's calming effect on visitors and arranged special sessions for their young patients. Dr. Sarah Miller. Thomas still smiled at his daughter's new title, had earned her certification in animal-assisted therapy, combining her farming background with her desire to help others. She stood now in the heated indoor observation area they'd built, adjacent to Martha's barn, explaining to the children's parents how these sessions worked. "Martha has a special gift," she told them, watching as the children gathered around the gentle old cow. "She seems to know exactly what each person needs, whether it's quiet comfort or playful interaction. We've seen remarkable improvements in emotional well-being, especially with children facing long-term medical challenges." Among the young visitors was a quiet girl named Lucy, who hadn't spoken since beginning her cancer treatments 3 months ago. Her mother hung back anxiously as Lucy approached Martha's stall, but Thomas saw something in the child's expression that he recognized, the same look Sarah had worn all those years ago when Martha had first saved her life. Martha turned her head slowly toward Lucy, then did something that made the observers gasp softly. She carefully lowered herself to lie in the straw, bringing her head down to the little girl's level. Lucy reached out tentatively, then stepped closer, finally wrapping her arms around Martha's neck in a gentle hug. "Soft," Lucy whispered, breaking her months of silence. "She's so soft." Dr. Catherine Wells, who had been documenting Martha's interactions with visitors, wiped tears from her eyes as she made her notes. "We've been studying animal-human bonds for months now," she said quietly to Thomas, "but moments like this still take my breath away. The center had expanded its focus beyond traditional agricultural education. While farmers and corporate managers still came to learn about balanced farming practices, the facility had become a hub for research into the deeper connections between humans and animals. Dr. Chen's team had published groundbreaking papers on emotional intelligence in livestock, using Martha as their primary case study. Conway arrived later that morning for a scheduled presentation, but instead of heading straight to the conference room, he stopped to watch the children with Martha. "You know," he said to Thomas, "when I first met you at that auction, I thought I knew everything about agricultural efficiency. Now I realize I didn't understand the most efficient thing of all, how quickly kindness multiplies when you give it room to grow." The presentation that followed wasn't just for farmers or business leaders. The audience included medical professionals, psychologists, educators, and even architects interested in designing spaces that fostered healing connections between humans and animals. Martha's story had sparked a movement that crossed professional boundaries and challenged traditional assumptions about value and progress. Eleanor Henderson had become a regular speaker at these sessions, sharing not just James's journals, but her own observations of how Martha had changed their community. "James always said that animals could teach us things we couldn't learn from books," she told the gathered crowd. "But I don't think even he imagined how far those lessons would reach." As the day progressed, Lucy's mother approached Thomas with tears in her eyes. "The doctors said the emotional withdrawal was as concerning as the physical symptoms," she explained. "We've tried everything to help her engage again. How is it that one gentle old cow could do what teams of specialists couldn't?" Thomas thought, and carefully before responding. "Sometimes the most powerful medicine isn't about curing, it's about caring. Martha survived that flood all those years ago because she cared more about saving my Sarah than about saving herself. That kind of love, it leaves marks on a soul." Maybe that's what Lucy felt today. The afternoon brought another group of visitors, students from the state's veterinary school. They were part of a new program that combined traditional veterinary medicine with what they now called emotional welfare studies. Martha had become a case study in their curriculum, proving that understanding an animal's emotional capacity was as important as knowing their physical needs. Dr. Chen presented her latest findings to the veterinary students, showing how Martha's interactions with visitors created measurable changes in stress hormones, heart rates, and other physiological markers. "But the numbers only tell part of the story," she admitted. "There's something here that goes beyond scientific measurement, something that reminds us why humans and animals formed bonds in the first place." As evening approached and the last visitors departed, Sarah found her father standing in Martha's barn, gently brushing the old cow's coat. "You know, Dad," she said, "when you bid on Martha at that auction, people thought you were wasting money on a worthless old cow. Now she's helping change how the whole world thinks about worth and value." Thomas nodded, remembering that day that seemed so long ago now. "Your mother used to say that every act of kindness creates ripples we can't see. Sometimes those ripples turn into waves that change the whole landscape." Through the barn window, they could see the lights of the research center glowing softly in the winter darkness. The heritage wheat slept under its blanket of snow, the young oak stood strong against the winter wind, and all around them, the seeds of change they'd planted continued to grow in unexpected and beautiful ways. Spring arrived at Willow Creek Farm with an explosion of new life. The heritage wheat planted around Martha's pasture had not only survived the winter, but had spread, creating a golden border that rippled in the warm breeze. The young oak from James's tree had sprouted its first fresh leaves, and the research center buzzed with renewed energy. But the most significant new arrival was currently standing in Martha's pasture, a wobbly-legged calf who represented something extraordinary. After months of careful planning and consultation with veterinary experts, the center had successfully used Martha's genetic material to create an embryo, carrying forward her remarkable lineage. It's unprecedented, Dr. Catherine Wells explained, to the gathering of journalists and researchers. We've never attempted to preserve the genetics of a cow specifically for emotional intelligence traits. But Martha's DNA showed some unique markers that our team believed were worth protecting. The little calf, named Hope by unanimous vote, shared her ancestors' gentle brown eyes and distinctive markings. More importantly, early observations suggested she possessed the same extraordinary empathy that had made Martha special. Sarah spent hours documenting the calf's interactions with visitors, noting behaviors that miraculously mirrored Martha's. Martha herself had taken to her role as genetic grandmother with characteristic grace. Though age had slowed her considerably, she watched over Hope with obvious pride, positioning herself so she could observe the calf's interactions with visitors while conserving her energy. "Look at this," Dr. Chen called out excitedly one morning, pointing to her monitors. Hope's stress response patterns when interacting with distressed visitors are nearly identical to Martha's. It's as if the capacity for emotional connection was passed down at a genetic level. The discovery had profound implications for the future of animal breeding programs. Conway, who had once focused solely on production metrics, now led the initiative to incorporate emotional intelligence traits into breeding selection criteria. "We've been breeding for physical traits for centuries," he explained to a group of industrial farmers. "But what if we've been overlooking the most valuable characteristics? What if emotional intelligence is as important as milk production or a growth rate?" The spring also brought a special visitor to the center, Lucy, the young cancer patient who had spoken her first words in months to Martha during the winter. Now in remission, she had asked to celebrate her recovery with the cow who had helped her find her voice again. "The doctors say my numbers are better than expected," Lucy's mother told Thomas, watching her daughter sitting in the pasture with both Martha and Hope. "But I think the real healing started that day in the barn. Something about Martha's presence. It gave Lucy a reason to fight." The center had expanded to include a full medical research wing, where doctors and scientists studied the physiological effects of animal interaction on human health. The Martha Protocol, as it had come to be known, was being implemented in hospitals across the country. Sarah had developed a comprehensive training program for other therapy animals, using the insights gained from studying Martha. "We can't replicate Martha exactly," she explained to a group of healthcare professionals, "but we can learn from her example about the power of genuine emotional connection." One quiet afternoon, as Thomas watched Hope playing in the spring sunshine, Eleanor joined him at the fence. "James would never believe all this," she said, gesturing to the bustling research center. "Or maybe he would. He always said Martha was special, right from the day she was born." Thomas nodded, remembering that day at the auction when everyone had laughed at him for bidding on an old cow. Sometimes the most valuable things are the ones most people overlook. The heritage wheat around the pasture had begun spreading its seeds, creating new growth beyond the original planting. Dr. Wells saw it as a perfect metaphor for the center's impact. Like these wheat seeds, the lessons we're learning here are spreading naturally, taking root in places we never expected. A new program had begun, partnering with agricultural schools to create scholarships for students interested in studying the intersection of traditional farming wisdom and modern science. The Henderson Scholars, as they were known, spent time at the center learning from Martha and Hope while conducting their own research into animal-human connections. Lucy had become something of an ambassador for the program, speaking to other children about her experience. "Martha knew what I needed before I did," she told a group of young patients. "She showed me that being sick didn't mean I had to be alone." Hope, as if understanding her role in this continuing story, had developed her own unique way of connecting with visitors, While Martha offered calm, steady presence, Hope brought playful energy that particularly resonated with children. Together, they demonstrated different aspects of healing interaction. It's not just about preserving Martha's genetics, Dr. Chen explained to her research team. It's about understanding and protecting these extraordinary capabilities that we're only beginning to comprehend. Hope represents both a continuation and an evolution of what Martha showed us was possible. The spring days grew longer, filled with new discoveries and possibilities. The center had become a place where science and compassion worked hand in hand, where ancient farming wisdom met cutting-edge research, and where an old cow's legacy continued to grow in unexpected ways. Unexpected, as Thomas watched Lucy reading a book to both Martha and Hope in the late afternoon sun, he remembered something his wife had once said. "Love doesn't divide when you share it. It multiplies." Looking at the thriving research center, the spreading wheat, the growing oak, and most importantly at Martha and Hope together in their peaceful pasture, he understood more than ever the truth of those words. The summer heat shimmered over Willow Creek Farm as delegates from agricultural programs worldwide gathered for the first international conference on compassionate farming. The research center had become a beacon of innovation, drawing people from every continent to learn about what they now called the Martha Revolution in agricultural practices. Thomas watched from his familiar spot on the porch as visitors from Japan, India, Brazil, and dozens of other countries made their way toward the central conference hall. Each brought their own cultural wisdom about the connection between humans and animals, creating a rich tapestry of knowledge that expanded far beyond what anyone had imagined possible when this all began. "It's remarkable," Dr. Catherine Wells said, joining Thomas with her ever-present tablet. "We've received research papers from over 30 countries, all building on what we learned from Martha. Traditional farmers in India are documenting similar emotional intelligence in their cattle. A team in Kenya has been studying multi-generational behavioral patterns that mirror what we're seeing with Hope." Martha, now in her twilight years, had taken to spending most of her time in the shade of the growing oak tree, watching the world she'd helped create unfold around her. Hope, nearly full-grown, had developed into an extraordinary continuation of her predecessor's legacy. Together, they represented both the wisdom of experience and the promise of the future. Sarah, now recognized as a leading expert in animal-assisted therapy, was preparing to present the keynote address. Her work combining traditional farming wisdom with modern therapeutic techniques had created a new field of study. The Martha method, as it was known in medical circles, was being implemented in hospitals and treatment centers worldwide. "You know what amazes me most?" Sarah asked her father as they walked together toward the conference hall. "It's not just the scientific breakthroughs or the medical applications. It's how this has changed the way people think about value. Every day, somewhere in the world, someone looks at something others have dismissed and sees its true worth." The conference's main hall was filled with displays showcasing the global impact of Martha's story. A team from Argentina presented research on how implementing compassionate farming practices had not only improved animal welfare, but had actually increased productivity. Japanese researchers shared studies on the correlation between farmer-animal emotional bonds and the quality of agricultural products. Lucy, now cancer-free and thriving, had been invited to speak about her experience. Standing at the podium with confidence that would have seemed impossible during her illness, she addressed the international audience. "Martha taught me that healing isn't just about medicine," she said. "It's about connection, about being seen and understood. Sometimes the greatest strength comes from the gentlest touch." Conway, who had become one of the most passionate advocates for compassionate farming, presented data showing how agricultural corporations that had adopted the new approach were seeing unprecedented success. "We thought efficiency meant detachment," he admitted to the audience. "We were wrong. True efficiency comes from understanding and honoring the deep connections that make farming work." The heritage wheat that had started as a simple gesture now grew in test plots around the world, each region adapting it to local conditions while maintaining its connection to the original story. Dr. Chen's team had discovered that plants grown in fields where strong animal-human bonds existed showed subtly different growth patterns. "It's as if the entire agricultural ecosystem responds to emotional harmony," she explained, showing comparative data. "We're finding that farms practicing compassionate agriculture have more robust soil microbiomes, stronger plant growth, and more resilient animal populations." Eleanor Henderson, though elderly now, still commanded attention when she spoke about James's journals. International researchers had begun studying his observations, finding that his intuitive understanding of animal behavior often preceded modern scientific discoveries by decades. "James used to say that every farm was a conversation," Eleanor told the gathered academics and farmers, "a conversation between the land and those who worked it, between the animals and those who cared for them." He believed that the quality of that conversation determined the quality of everything that grew from it. As the afternoon sessions continued, Thomas made his way back to Martha's pasture. The old cow greeted him with the same gentle wisdom that had changed so many lives. Hope, seeing her grandmother's movement, came to join them at the fence. "You know," Thomas said to them both, "when I made that bid at the auction, people thought I was throwing money away. Now look at what that investment has returned. Not in dollars, but in understanding, in healing, in wisdom shared across the world." The conference had drawn unexpected attention from other fields as well. Environmental scientists were studying how compassionate farming practices improved ecosystem health. Psychologists researched the ripple effects of animal-human bonds on community well-being. Economists analyzed how empathy-based agricultural models could create more sustainable food systems. A group of young farmers from Africa shared their experiences implementing Martha-inspired programs in their communities. "In our traditions, we always knew animals were more than just resources," their spokesperson explained. "But Martha's story gave us the bridge we needed to connect our ancient wisdom with modern understanding." As the sun began to set on another transformative day at Willow Creek Farm, the international delegates gathered in Martha's pasture for a closing ceremony. The heritage wheat swayed in the evening breeze. The young oak cast long shadows, and the research center's lights began to glow against the darkening sky. Sarah ended her keynote speech with words that resonated across languages and cultures. "Martha showed us that true value isn't in what we take from the land, but in what we give back to it. She taught us that the most important yields we can measure are the ones that grow in the heart." The autumn winds swept through Willow Creek Farm, carrying with them the sweet scent of ripening apples and the gentle rustling of the heritage wheat. Thomas sat on the bench near Martha's pasture, aware that time was doing what time always does. Martha, now in her 18th year, had grown frailer with each passing season, yet her eyes remained as kind and wise as ever, reflecting a soul that had touched countless lives. Dr. Catherine Wells had noticed the changes too. The research team monitored Martha's health carefully, documenting every aspect of her remarkable life for future generations. "She's not in any pain," Catherine assured Thomas one crisp morning. "She's just gracefully completing her circle." The news had spread quietly through the international network of researchers, farmers, and healthcare workers who had been touched by Martha's story. Messages of gratitude began flowing in from around the world. Each one carried a different story of how this once dismissed old cow had changed their understanding of value, compassion, and connection. Lucy, now a bright and healthy teenager, visited almost daily. She had started a youth program called Martha's Kids, helping other young people facing illness or trauma connect with therapy animals. This afternoon, she sat in the pasture, reading letters from children worldwide who had been helped by programs inspired by Martha. Dear Martha, one letter read, "Before I met the therapy cow at our local farm, I hadn't spoken in 2 years after the accident. But something about her eyes reminded me that it was okay to trust again. Thank you for showing the world that sometimes the best medicine doesn't come in bottles." Hope, fully grown now, had developed her own unique way of carrying forward her grandmother's legacy. While Martha had been a steady, calming presence, Hope brought an active, engaging energy to her interactions. Together, they demonstrated different aspects of healing connection, showing how empathy could adapt to meet various needs. Sarah had been documenting everything, working with Maria Santos to create a comprehensive record of Martha's impact. "It's not just about preserving the story," she explained to a group of visiting journalists. "It's about understanding how one act of compassion can ripple out to touch countless lives." Conway, who had once laughed at Thomas for bidding on an old cow, now stood in Martha's pasture with tears in his eyes. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think I understood value. I had spreadsheets, profit margins, productivity metrics. But Martha taught me that the most valuable things in life are the ones you can't measure." The research center had become a living testament to this philosophy. The Martha Protocol had been implemented in healthcare facilities across 6 continents. Agricultural programs worldwide had incorporated compassionate farming principles into their curricula. Even large corporate farms had begun measuring success not just in yields and profits, but in the strength of the bonds between farmers and their animals. Eleanor Henderson, wearing her late husband's old jacket against the autumn chill, spent long hours sitting with Martha. "James knew," she would say, stroking Martha's greying coat. "He knew from the day she was born that she had something special to teach us. He just never imagined how far those lessons would reach." As the day progressed, Thomas noticed more visitors arriving at the farm. Word had spread about Martha's declining health, and people were coming to pay their respects. They came quietly, reverently, each carrying their own story of how this remarkable animal had touched their lives. Dr. Chen's research team had set up their equipment to document these final days, but even their scientific detachment had given way to emotion. "We've proven so much through our studies," Dr. Chen said, wiping her eyes. "The physiological effects of animal empathy, the genetic markers for emotional intelligence, the impact on human health outcomes. But sitting here now, watching people come from around the world to thank one old cow, that tells us more than any data ever could." The heritage wheat around the pasture had spread far beyond its original boundaries, creating a golden sea that rippled in the autumn breeze. The oak sapling from James's tree had grown strong and tall, its branches now providing shade where Martha spent her days. These living symbols of growth and continuity seemed especially poignant now. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the pasture, Thomas sat with Martha while Hope grazed nearby. "You know," he said softly, "when I made that bid at the auction, people thought I was crazy. They couldn't see what I saw, what James saw. They couldn't understand that sometimes the greatest value lies in the things others overlook." Sarah joined them, carrying the worn photograph that had started it all, the image of Martha saving her from the flood. "Everything that's grown here," she said, "every life touched, every lesson learned, every heart healed. It all started because you saw worth where others saw waste." The research center glowed softly in the gathering dusk, its lights a beacon of hope and understanding for a world that was learning to value compassion as much as computation. The International Conference Hall, the therapy centers, the educational facilities, all stood as testament to the power of one farmer's promise and one cow's extraordinary heart. Lucy arrived with a group of her Martha's kids, each carrying a lantern. They had started a tradition of evening storytelling sessions in the pasture, sharing tales of healing and hope. Tonight, they settled in a circle near Martha, their lanterns creating a warm glow as the stars began to appear above. "Every ending is also a beginning," Lucy told the group, her voice strong and clear. "Everything Martha taught us, about love, about value, about seeing with our hearts, those lessons will keep growing, keep spreading, keep changing lives long after she's gone." Martha watched the gathering with her characteristic gentle wisdom, her presence a reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism come wrapped in the most humble packages. Hope stood close by, ready to carry forward a legacy that had grown far beyond what anyone could have imagined on that long-ago day at the auction. The morning dawned clear and crisp, painting Willow Creek Farm in shades of gold and amber. Thomas knew, with the kind of certainty that comes from years of working with animals, that today would be different. Martha, who had touched so many lives with her gentle wisdom, was preparing for her final journey. Dr. Catherine Wells had stayed overnight at the farm, monitoring Martha's condition with a mixture of professional dedication and personal attachment. The old cow had grown weaker through the night, but there was a peaceful dignity in her manner that touched everyone present. "She's not in any distress," Catherine assured Thomas softly. "She's just ready, like she knows her work here is complete." Word spread quickly through the network of lives Martha had touched. People began arriving at the farm in quiet groups, moving respectfully toward the pasture where Martha lay in the warm morning sun. Hope stayed close to her grandmother, occasionally, nuzzling her gently, demonstrating a depth of understanding that seemed to transcend ordinary animal behavior. Sarah coordinated with the research center staff, ensuring that Martha's final hours would be documented, not just for scientific purposes, but as a testament to the extraordinary bond between humans and animals. "Every moment with her has been a lesson," she told the gathering crowd. "Even now she's teaching us about grace and dignity." Lucy arrived with a group of her Martha's kids, their young faces solemn but serene. They carried flowers, not store-bought bouquets, but wildflowers, gathered from the fields where Martha's story had unfolded. Each child had written a message of gratitude, creating a circle of cards around the beloved cow. Eleanor Henderson sat quietly on the bench near Martha, James's old journal open in her lap. "James wrote something here," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "The day Martha was born, he wrote, 'There's something in this calf's eyes that speaks of wisdom beyond our understanding. Sometimes I think we don't really own these animals. We're just blessed with their presence for a while.'" Conway arrived with representatives from agricultural organizations worldwide. The corporate executive who had once mocked Thomas's decision at the auction now knelt respectfully beside Martha, tears flowing freely. "You changed everything," he whispered. "You helped us remember what farming is really about." Dr. Chen's research team worked quietly, documenting Martha's final hours while struggling to maintain their scientific objectivity. Their instruments recorded something remarkable. As people gathered to say goodbye, Martha's vital signs showed patterns of peaceful interaction, as if she was still, even now, offering comfort to those around her. The heritage wheat swayed gently in the morning breeze, its golden stalks catching the light. The oak tree from James's farm cast dappled shadows over the gathering, its branches seeming to reach protectively over the scene below. These living symbols of Martha's legacy stood as testament to the way her influence had taken root and grown. Thomas sat close to Martha's head, gently stroking her neck as he had done countless times over the years. You know, he said, his voice carrying to the hushed crowd, when I made that bid at the auction, people thought I was wasting money on a worthless old cow. But true value isn't in what something costs. It's in what it teaches us about love. Sarah brought out the photograph that had started it all, the image of Martha saving her from the flood. She placed it where Martha could see it, a reminder of the moment when one cow's extraordinary heart had changed the course of countless lives. Hope, sensing the solemnity of the moment, positioned herself protectively near Martha, demonstrating the emotional intelligence that had been passed down through their special lineage. Her presence offered comfort not just to her grandmother, but to all those gathered to say goodbye. Lucy stepped forward, her voice clear in the morning air. "Before I met Martha, I was lost in silence," she said. "She taught me that sometimes the greatest strength comes in the quietest moments, that healing isn't just about getting better, it's about being understood." Throughout the morning, people shared stories of how Martha had touched their lives. Healthcare workers spoke of patients who had found their voice through animal therapy programs inspired by her story. Farmers described how learning about Martha had transformed their approach to agriculture. Scientists admitted how studying her had changed their understanding of animal consciousness. As the sun climbed higher, Martha's breathing grew softer. Thomas noticed her eyes seeking out each person in the gathering, as if offering a final gentle blessing. The research equipment recorded a remarkable phenomenon. Everyone present showed synchronized stress reduction patterns, as if Martha was offering one last lesson in the healing power of connection. Dr. Wells watched her monitors with tears in her eyes. "Even now," she whispered, "she's teaching us. These readings, they're showing us something profound about the way beings can connect and heal each other." The international delegates who had remained after the conference stood respectfully at the edge of the gathering, representing the global reach of Martha's influence. Through translators, they shared how her story had transformed farming practices in their countries, breaking down barriers between traditional wisdom and modern methods. As the moment drew near, a gentle breeze stirred the heritage wheat, creating a whispered melody across the fields. Hope moved closer to Martha, placing her head gently against her grandmother's neck. The gathered crowd fell silent, understanding they were witnessing something sacred. Thomas held Martha's head in his lap, feeling the weight of all the years, all the lives touched, all the wisdom shared. "Thank you," he whispered, speaking for everyone present. "Thank you for showing us what real value looks like. Thank you for teaching us that sometimes the greatest gifts come in the most unexpected packages." Martha's final breath was as gentle as her soul had been. In that moment, as tears flowed freely among the gathered crowd, Hope raised her head and let out a soft, mournful sound that seemed to carry all the love and gratitude that words couldn't express. 1 year after Martha's passing, Willow Creek Farm bloomed with new life. The heritage wheat she had watched over now grew in abundance, its golden waves stretching far beyond the original boundaries. The oak tree from James's farm stood tall and strong, its branches sheltering a special place where Martha's story lived on. Thomas stood at the entrance to the newly completed Martha Memorial Garden, watching as visitors from around the world made their way along the peaceful paths. The garden had been designed as a living tribute, incorporating elements from every chapter of Martha's extraordinary journey. "It's perfect," Sarah said, joining her father. "Every detail tells part of her story." The garden's central feature was a beautiful bronze sculpture showing Martha in her prime, helping a young girl through troubled waters, an artistic interpretation of that fateful night when she had saved Sarah's life. Hope, now fully grown, and carrying her grandmother's legacy forward, had her own special area in the garden where she continued Martha's work. The research team had documented remarkable similarities in how she connected with visitors, particularly children, showing that Martha's gift for healing had truly passed to the next generation. Lucy, now studying veterinary medicine with a focus on animal-assisted therapy, led regular tours through the garden. Martha's story teaches us that value isn't about age or appearance, she told today's group. It's about the capacity for love and the courage to show it. The International Center for Compassionate Agriculture, as the research facility had come to be known, had expanded its scope far beyond its original mission. Dr. Catherine Wells stood in the new conference center, addressing a group of agricultural leaders from around the world. Martha's legacy isn't just about farming or therapy or science, she explained. It's about remembering that the most important things in life often come disguised as something others might overlook. Her story has transformed how we think about value, connection, and healing. The Martha Protocol had become standard practice in healthcare facilities worldwide. Hospitals, rehabilitation centers, and therapy programs had adopted the principles first observed in Martha's interactions with visitors. The results continued to exceed expectations, showing how animal-human bonds could accelerate healing and recovery. Conway, who had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all, now served as the center's director of ethical agriculture. "I used to think farming was all about numbers," he told a group of corporate executives. "Martha taught us that the most valuable assets can't be measured in traditional ways." The heritage wheat that had started as a simple gesture had developed into something remarkable. Agricultural researchers had discovered that the strain possessed unique resilience and nutritional properties. "It's as if the wheat grew stronger through its connection to Martha's story," Dr. Chen explained. "We're finding similar patterns in crops grown using compassionate farming methods." Eleanor Henderson's collection of James's journals had been published, becoming a foundational text for a new generation of farmers learning to balance traditional wisdom with modern methods. "James always said that farming was about having a conversation with the land and its creatures," she told a group of students. "Martha helped us remember how to listen." The garden paths led visitors through different aspects of Martha's story. The auction where she had been dismissed as worthless, the flood where she had shown extraordinary courage, the years of gentle healing she had offered to countless visitors. Each station included testimonials from people whose lives had been touched by her spirit. Hope had given birth to her first calf, continuing Martha's lineage. The young calf, named Faith, already showed signs of the same extraordinary empathy that had made her grandmother famous. Researchers were fascinated by how these emotional intelligence traits seemed to strengthen through the generations. Thomas watched as Lucy's Martha's Kids program conducted their daily session in the garden. Children facing various challenges found comfort and courage through their connections with hope and faith, just as others had with Martha. The program had spread internationally, with similar initiatives taking root wherever Martha's story was shared. Sarah had completed her book about Martha's life, but more importantly, about the ripple effects of compassion and understanding that continued to spread from one seemingly simple decision to see value where others saw none. Martha's story reminds us that every act of kindness, every moment of understanding, plants seeds that can grow into something extraordinary, she wrote in the introduction. The research center had become a place of pilgrimage for people seeking to understand deeper truths about connection, healing, and value. Scientists studied the measurable effects of compassionate farming, while spiritual leaders contemplated the deeper meanings in Martha's story. Together, they were creating a new understanding of humanity's relationship with the natural world. As the sun began to set on another day at Willow Creek Farm, Thomas sat on his familiar bench, now positioned perfectly to view both the garden and the pasture, where hope and faith continued Martha's work. The heritage wheat swayed in the evening breeze, The oak tree cast long shadows, and the research center's lights began to twinkle in the gathering dusk. "You know," he said to Sarah, who had joined him for their evening ritual, "your mother used to say that love never really ends. It just changes form." Looking at all this, seeing how Martha's love continues to grow and change lives, I understand what she meant. Around them the garden hummed with life, visitors sharing stories, researchers documenting new discoveries, children finding healing, and farmers learning ancient wisdom made new again. Martha's story had become more than a memory. It had become a living force for change, a reminder that the truest measure of value lies not in what the world sees at first glance, but in the capacity of a heart to touch others. The bronze sculpture caught the last rays of sunlight, making Martha's gentle eyes seem to glow with the same wisdom that had changed so many lives. Her legacy lived on, not just in hope and faith, but in every person who learned to look past surface appearances to find the true worth within, in every farmer who chose compassion over convenience, and in every heart that opened to the possibility that sometimes the greatest gifts come in the most unexpected forms. As night fell over Willow Creek Farm, the stars appeared one by one, their eternal light a reminder that some stories never truly end. They just keep growing, touching lives, and changing the world in quiet but profound ways. Martha's story had become such a light, guiding people toward a deeper understanding of value, connection, and the extraordinary power of seeing worth in the overlooked, worth